Hegel's Phenomenology spirit. Independence and dependence of self-consciousness. Lordship and bondage continued. In this experience, self-consciousness learns that life is as essential to it as pure self-consciousness. In immediate self-consciousness, the simple I is absolute mediation and has as its essential moment lasting independence. The dissolution of that simple unity is the result of the first experience. Through this there is posited a pure self-consciousness and a consciousness which is not purely for itself but for another. That is a merely immediate consciousness or consciousness in the form of thinghood. Both moments are essential, since to begin with they are unequal and opposed, and their reflection into a unity has not yet been achieved. They exist as two opposed shapes of consciousness. One is the independent consciousness, whose essential nature is to be for itself. The other is the dependent consciousness, whose essential nature is simply to live or to be for another. The former is Lord, the other is Bondsman. The Lord is the consciousness that exists for itself, but no longer merely the notion of such a consciousness. Rather, it is a consciousness existing for itself, which is mediated with itself through another consciousness. That is, through a consciousness whose nature is to be bound up with an existence that is independent, or thinghood in general. The Lord puts himself into relation with both of these moments, to a thing as such, the object of desire, and to the consciousness for which thinghood is the essential characteristic, and since he is a qua the notion of self-consciousness, an immediate relation of being for self, but B is now at the same time mediation, or a being for self, which is for itself only through another, he is related A immediately to both, and B immediately to each through the other. The Lord relates himself immediately to the bondsman through a being, a thing, that is independent, for it is just this which holds the bondsman in bondage. It is his chain from which he could not break free in the struggle, thus proving himself to be dependent, to possess his independence in thinghood. But the Lord is the power over this thing, for he proved in the struggle that it is worthy, it is something merely negative. Since he is the power over this thing, and this again is the power over the other, the bondsman, it follows that he holds the other in subjection. Equally, the Lord relates himself immediately to the thing through the bondsman. The bondsman, qua self-consciousness in general, also relates himself negatively to the thing and takes away its independence, but at the same time the thing is independent vis-a-vis the bondsman, whose negating of it therefore cannot go the length of being altogether done with it, to the point of annihilation. In other words, he only works on it. For the Lord, on the other hand, the immediate relation becomes through this mediation the sheer negation of the thing, or the enjoyment of it. What desire failed to achieve, he succeeds in doing, viz. To have done with the thing altogether, and to achieve satisfaction in the enjoyment of it. Desire failed to do this because of the thing's independence, but the Lord, who has interposed the bondsman between it and himself, takes to himself only the dependent aspect of the thing, and has the pure enjoyment of it. The aspect of its independence he leaves to the bondsman, who works on it. In both of these moments, the Lord achieves his recognition through another consciousness, for in them that other consciousness is expressly something unessential, both by its working on the thing and by its dependence on a specific existence. In neither case can it be Lord over the being of the thing and achieve absolute negation of it. Here, therefore, is present this moment of recognition, namely, that the other consciousness set aside its own being for self, and in so doing itself does what the first does to it. Similarly, the other moment too is present, that this action of the second is the first's own action, for what the bondsman does is really the action of the Lord. The latter's essential nature is to exist only for himself. He is the sheer negative power, for whom the thing is nothing. Thus he is the pure essential action in this relationship, while the action of the bondsman is impure and unessential. But for recognition proper, the moment is lacking, that what the Lord does to the other he also does to himself, and what the bondsman does to himself he should also do to the other. The outcome is a recognition that is one-sided and unequal. In this recognition, the unessential consciousness is for the Lord the object, which constitutes the truth of his certainty of himself, but it is clear that this object does not correspond to its notion, but rather that the object in which the Lord has achieved his lordship has in reality turned out to be something quite different from an independent consciousness. What now really confronts him is not an independent consciousness, but a dependent one. He is therefore not certain of being for self as the truth of himself. On the contrary, his truth is in reality the unessential consciousness and its unessential action. The truth of the independent consciousness is accordingly the servile consciousness of the bondsman. This, it is true, appears at the first outside of itself, and not as the truth of self-consciousness, but just as lordship showed that its essential nature is the reverse of what it wants to be, so too servitude in its consummation will really turn into the opposite of what it immediately is, as a consciousness forced back into itself. It will withdraw into itself and be transformed into a truly independent consciousness. We have seen what servitude is only in relation to lordship, but it is a self-consciousness, and we have now to consider what as such it is in and for itself. To begin with, servitude has the Lord for its essential reality, hence the truth for it is the independent consciousness that is for itself. However, servitude is not yet aware that this truth is implicit in it, but it does in fact contain within itself this truth of pure negativity and being for self, for it has experienced this its own essential nature. For this consciousness has been fearful, not of this or that particular thing, or just at odd moments, but its whole being has been seized with dread, for it has experienced the fear of death, the absolute Lord. In that experience it has been quite unmanned, has trembled in every fibre of its being, and everything solid and stable has been shaken to its foundations. But this pure universal movement, the absolute melting away of everything stable, is the simple essential nature of self-consciousness, absolute negativity, pure being for self, which consequently is implicit in this consciousness. This moment of pure being for self is also explicit for the bondsman, for in the Lord it exists for him as his object. Furthermore, his consciousness is not this dissolution of everything stable, merely in principle. In his service he actually brings this about. Through his service he rids himself of his attachment to natural existence in every single detail, and gets rid of it by working on it. However, the feeling of absolute power, both in general and in the particular form of service, is only implicitly this dissolution, and although the fear of the Lord is indeed the beginning of wisdom, consciousness is not therein aware that it is a being for self. Through work, however, the bondsman becomes conscious of what he truly is. In the moment which corresponds to desire in the Lord's consciousness, it did seem that the aspect of unessential relation to the thing fell to the lot of the bondsman, since in that relation the thing retained its independence. Desire has reserved to itself the pure negating of the object, and thereby its unalloyed feeling of self, but that is the reason why this satisfaction is itself only a fleeting one, for it lacks the side of objectivity and permanence. Work, on the other hand, is desire, held in check, fleetingness staved off. In other words, work forms and shapes the thing. the negative relation to the object becomes its form and something permanent, because it is precisely for the worker that the object has independence. This negative middle term of the formative activity is at the same time the individuality or pure being for self of consciousness, which now in the work outside of it acquires an element of permanence. It is in this way, therefore, that consciousness, qua worker, comes to see in the independent being of the object its own independence. But the formative activity has not only this positive significance, that in it the pure being for self of the servile consciousness acquires an existence. It also has, in contrast with its first moment, the negative significance of fear. For in fashioning the thing, the bondsman's own negativity, his being for self, becomes an object for him only through his setting at naught the existing shape confronting him. But this objective negative moment is none other than the alien being before which it has trembled. Now, however, he destroys this alien negative moment, posits himself as a negative in the permanent order of things, and thereby he comes for himself, someone existing on his own account. In the Lord, the being for self is another, for the bondsman, or is only for him, that is not his own. In fear, the being for self is present in the bondsman himself. In fashioning the thing, he becomes aware that being for self belongs to him, that he himself exists essentially and actually in his own right. The shape does not become something other than himself through being made external to him, for it is precisely this shape that is his pure being for self, which in this externality is seen by him to be the truth. Through the rediscovery of himself by himself, the bondsman realizes that it is precisely in his work, where he seemed to have only an alienated existence, that he acquires a mind of his own. For this reflection, the two moments of fear and service as such, as also that of formative activity, are necessary, both being at the same time in a universal mode. Without the discipline of service and obedience, fear remains at the formal stage, and does not extend to the known real world of existence. Without the formative activity, fear remains inward and mute, and consciousness does not become explicitly for itself. If consciousness fashions the thing without that initial absolute fear, it is only an empty self-centered attitude, for its form of negativity is not negativity per se, and therefore its formative activity cannot give it a consciousness of itself as essential being. If it has not experienced absolute fear, but only some lesser dread, the negative being has remained for it something external. Its substance has not been infected by it through and through. Since the entire contents of its natural consciousness have not been jeopardized, determinate being still in principle attaches to it. Having a mind of one's own is self-win, a freedom which is still enmeshed in servitude, just as little as the pure form can become essential being for it, just as little is that form regarded as extended to the particular a universal formative activity, an absolute notion. Rather it is a skill which is master over some things, but not over the universal power and the whole of objective being.